Okay, we're going to look at the 4.1 class notes. We don't have a whole lot, but there's an important piece we need to talk about here, which is how we got to our current understanding. In our early models of the atom, and when you get to this point, you should already have had done the reading and notes and filled this in. I'm just going to point out some pieces of this that are really key. When we define an atom as the smallest part of an element that retains its identity in a chemical reaction, that's kind of a beginning understanding for atoms. And we have to go back a little bit in history to even think about where we came up with the concept of an atom. Democritus, several thousand years ago, was the first one to think that if you divide something to smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, you would finally get to something that you couldn't divide further, and he used the term atom. Now that was just a thought experiment. He wasn't working with any scientific evidence to come to that. It wasn't until Dalton put together the current scientific information into what we call Dalton's atomic theory that we have something that tells us information about these things that we call atoms. He said that all elements are composed of tiny indivisible particles called atoms. I'm going to read through these and I'm going to tell you which parts of the theory are no longer accepted. The second part of Dalton's theory was that atoms of the same element are identical and atoms of an element differ from atoms of a different element. So one element's atoms are going to be different from another element's atoms. The third part is atoms of different elements can physically mix or chemically combine in whole number ratios to form compounds. And then lastly, chemical reactions occur when atoms are separated from each other or joined together or rearranged in different combinations. Atoms of one element are never changed into atoms of another element as a result of a chemical reaction. Now, all of these things were based on evidence that Dalton had at the time that he developed this theory. But there are multiple parts of this that are no longer accepted as true. And I'm going to give you information or experimental evidence that was developed that shows why we no longer accept it. So the first part of what is no longer accepted is true is that all elements are composed of tiny indivisible particles called atoms. So the idea that these are indivisible is no longer accepted. And there are two things that we can think of as evidence. So evidence that particles can be divided are found in the fact that the atoms have been split in nuclear reactions. So very large, say uranium or plutonium atoms actually literally split apart in a nuclear reaction, and that releases a lot of energy, and that would be a dividing of atoms. Another piece of evidence that tells us that atoms can be divided is we know that atoms themselves are made up of multiple small particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons, and that those subatomic particles are evidence that atoms can be divided further. So those are two pieces of evidence that atoms are no longer considered indivisible or not able to divide. The next part is when we consider the beginning of the second postulate of Dalton's, which is atoms of the same element are identical. Well, that's no longer considered to be true. So that would be another part of the theory that is no longer accepted. Atoms of the same elements will be identical in this way, in that they will all have the same number of protons. So, for example, oxygen atoms, every oxygen atom will have 8 protons in the nucleus. The way that atoms of the same element will not be exactly identical is in another subatomic particle that we call neutrons. So the type of variation in an atom that we call isotopes, where you have the same number of protons in the nucleus, so they're the same element, but they are different isotopes because they have different numbers of neutrons. That is telling us that atoms of the same element are not exactly identical. They can have different numbers of neutrons, but they will always have the same number of protons for a particular element. So that's some background information for parts of the theory that are no longer accepted. We know that atoms are no longer considered not able to divide. We can divide them. And we know that atoms of the same element can differ in the number of neutrons that they have, but not the number of protons.